Once regarded as the Duggar family's strong patriarch and a representation of traditional family values, Jim Bob Duggar was involved in a startling controversy. He was charged with embezzling assets that were legally the property of his daughter, Jinger Vuolo. Following the allegations, the matter swiftly proceeded to trial, where proof of stolen property and illegal transactions revealed a pattern of betrayal inside the family. Jim Bob was given a 6-month prison sentence after the court judged him guilty. The Duggar family's carefully cultivated public image came crashing down with the choice. Jim Bob, who had always portrayed himself as a man of values, was suddenly viewed as a dishonorable and greedy individual. Michelle Duggar's relationship with him started to deteriorate while he was serving his sentence. The weight of betrayal was too great to bear after years of devotion and a shared life. Hey guys, welcome to Vogue TV. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and let's dive into the latest news. Michelle became aloof, pondering her husband's transformation and grappling with the fact that her family was disintegrating. Once unified under their father's leadership, the children also turned away. They rejected him for his sins as much as his hypocrisy, and they denied that he was their father. At the heart of the controversy, Jinger publicly voiced her sorrow, believing that trust had been irrevocably damaged. The harm was irreparable by the time Jim Bob was let free. He had lost his reputation, his fortune, and most painfully, his familial ties. What was left was a broken home, characterized not by harmony but by distrust, quiet, and the reverberations of an unforgivable betrayal. Jim Bob Duggar had spent decades creating a persona as the ideal husband, the loving father, and the unwavering head of a large family. Behind closed doors, temptation had started to nibble at him. But to the outside world, he was the epitome of religion and order. No one in the family understood how important property, land, money, and ownership was to him. One of his many children, Jinger Vuolo, had become a woman in her own right. The Duggar method had given her and her husband a life that was a mixture of independence and a touch of disobedience. Her inheritance from a family investment was meant to be her own property, a foundation for her fresh start. That land, however, meant something different to Jim Bob: the loss of control. Jim Bob rummaged through papers late at night, lit by his desk lamp. He changed deeds, prepared silent transfers, and organized the paperwork to make it look authentic. Across lines intended for his daughter, his signature was inscribed. He persuaded himself it was justified with each pen stroke. The family had always been his responsibility, he reminded himself, and assets were safer in his hands. It was weeks before Jinger had any suspicions. Official seals were used to stamp the stiff envelopes in which the letters arrived. Before one document made her blood run cold. Her property was no longer hers. She had little regard for them. The deed was securely in her father's name after it had been signed away. The betrayal was silent and unnoticed by others, but it was a storm in Jinger's heart. In front of television cameras, she reenacted her father's sermons from their living room couch about faith and honesty, teaching she had learned as a youngster. Those remarks now seemed hollow. Rumors started to circulate in the Duggar household. Some of the older siblings observed that Jinger avoided her father's eyes and remained silent at family get-togethers. Sensing something was wrong, Michelle, who was normally ready to defend her husband, remained silent, torn between instinct and denial. They had sown the seeds of scandal. Jim Bob believed he had gained more authority, but in reality, he had set the stage for his demise. There had always been a lot of noise in the Duggar household. Children laughing, busy routines, and the constant buzz of cameras recording everything they did. Even the smaller kids could detect the odd tension that had now descended on the house. She made an effort to maintain her composure, but the weight of treachery weighed heavily on her every breath after Jinger revealed the truth. She showed them the papers, the official seals, and their father's undeniable signature as she discreetly confided in a sibling. Anger swiftly replaced shock, and soon rumors started to circulate around the home. Dad got it. They both mumbled. Another murmured, why would he do that to her? Jim Bob's word had been law for years. He was the one who oversaw every aspect, talked authoritatively, and demanded that the family adhere to the values he established. The fact that he had stolen from his own daughter now caused that authority to crumble. One evening at the dinner table, there was a confrontation. Even though Jinger's voice wavered, it was clear enough for everyone to hear. She placed the documents in front of him and remarked, "You signed my property into your name." "Why?" Jim Bob's fork clattered onto his plate as his face tensed. His remarks sounded hollow as he muttered about misunderstandings and family business. Michelle's hands were folded tightly in her lap as she sat rigidly next to him. Although she remained silent, her eyes showed uncertainty, bewilderment, and a hint of terror. The story was in the papers by morning. The records somehow made their way beyond the family's boundaries and into the hands of hungry reporters who had spent years following the Duggars. The headlines showed no mercy. Jim Bob Duggar is charged with embezzling his daughter's belongings. Patriarch of the Duggar family under fire. Reporters gathered outside the Duggar residence's gates, cameras flashing, mics ready. This was a real-time nightmare for a family that had endured so much public scrutiny. Once adoring fans started to turn on them, igniting uproar on social media and in online forums. The mood was somber within the house. Uncertain of what to say or do, the kids stepped warily. Clinging to the image they had always known, some stood up for their father. Realizing that the man who had advocated honesty had betrayed one of his own, others silently supported Jinger. Michelle's faith was tested and she found herself in the midst. Innumerable times before, she had spoken up for her husband, but this was different. It was neither an attack by a critic nor an accusation from an outsider. Their own daughter was pointing at her father with a quivering finger. There was no turning back from the controversy that had broken out. What had been spoken in the darkness was now yelled throughout the country. For the first time, everyone could see the fissures in the Duggar family's meticulously crafted facade of harmony. On the day Jim Bob Duggar went before the judge for the first time, the Springdale courthouse was packed with reporters. As the once revered patriarch entered the building stiffly with his Bible gripped under one arm, camera teams lined the pavements, focusing their lenses on him. Now, the murmurs of treachery had become loud and reverberated throughout social media feeds and television networks. It was a tense vibe within. Without wasting any time, the prosecution presented its case. The courtroom table was covered with stacks of papers, notarized deeds, and bank data. Every piece of document had incriminating evidence, such as witness statements indicating willful dishonesty, accounts redirected to Jim Bob's personal control, and property transactions that were falsified in his handwriting. The prosecutors were precise in their speech. They said that Jim Bob Duggar abused his position of trust by stealing property from Jinger Vuolo, his own daughter, and trying to pass it off as family business. This was no coincidence. It was intentional theft. Even Jinger sat in the courtroom, her face composed but sorrowful. She looked away from her father. For her, the profound hurt of betrayal was more important than wealth. Michelle's face was pallid as she sat silently next to her daughter. The life she had created with Jim Bob was further shattered by every statement made by the prosecution. The defense made an effort to provide an other image. Jim Bob's attorneys contended that he had misinterpreted the contracts and that this was an exaggerated clerical error. They brought to the court's attention his years of service in the public sector, his reputation as a family man, and his commitment to his faith. "I did not steal from my daughter," Jim Bob himself told the court in a stern yet quiet manner. "My life's work has always been with this family. I would never hurt them." But his reputation was overshadowed by the evidence. The consequences of his acts became indisputable, document by document and testimony by testimony. Jinger's statements pierced the defense like a razor when she was called to the stand. She declared, "I trusted him. My father took what wasn't his because I trusted him to protect me. I call it thievery, but he would call it family business." There was silence in the courtroom. Even others who had previously questioned the assertions shifted uneasily in their chairs. The judge handed down the decision following days of cross-examinations and testimony. "You are guilty of embezzlement, Jim Bob Duggar. You will be imprisoned for 6 months." The courtroom was filled with gasps. A few of the kids cried, while others gazed straight ahead, their features stern with silent rage. Michelle never glanced at her husband, but her hands were shaking as she gripped a tissue, tears running down her cheeks. The bailiff approached Jim Bob, who stood still. The sound of the handcuffs clicking around his wrists reverberated around the room like a final verdict. He had dedicated his life to establishing power, dominance, and a reputation for moral leadership. All of it was taken away in one instant. The downfall of a patriarch, the deterioration of a reputation, and the start of a prison sentence that would permanently tarnish his name were all caught on video outside. Michelle Duggar had always been the epitome of a devoted wife. She raised their kids in accordance with her husband's rules, defended him in interviews, and grinned on television. But something changed inside her once Jim Bob was removed in handcuffs. She initially made an effort to be unwavering. She advised the kids to pray for their father, saying he was misunderstood. Even she found those remarks less believable each time she said them. When the house was silent at night, she sat by herself in the kitchen and gazed at the vacant chair where Jim Bob used to dominate the dinner table. Prisoners sent letters, scripture, reassurances of fidelity, and entreaties for forgiveness were all stuffed into them by Jim Bob. As Michelle read them, each one seemed less like a confession and more like an order. "I was wrong" was never his statement. The treason was never acknowledged by him. Rather, he talked as if the family had let him down by not standing up for him. Michelle started to pull away. She no longer addressed him as dad in conversations with the kids. Rather, she called him Jim Bob, as though distancing the man from the character he had given up. "I've always believed in forgiveness," she said warily in her private confessional tapes for the reality crew. However, forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. "I'm not sure if I can trust him again at this time." The kids took note. Mom hardly spoke of their father anymore, some murmured. When his name was spoken, others noticed the mixture of grief and almost bitterness in her eyes. Michelle immersed herself into her children's lives, helping them through the disgrace that had befallen the family and catering to their needs. She no longer felt like Jim Bob's partner in that responsibility, but she did become a barrier between them and the outside world. She had protected him from the severity of public opinion for years. She wasn't sure she still believed in him. Her newfound independence was briefly captured on tape as she spoke confidently about parenting the family by herself, walked into church services by herself, and sat in the front row without Jim Bob by her side. Once submissive viewers started to see a subtle strength growing in her. Michelle held the pain of betrayal in her heart, not only for Jinger but also for herself. She had sacrificed her life for a guy who advocated integrity and morality, only to learn that he was able to take from his own child. The gap widened with each day that went by while he was speaking. By the time Jim Bob's release date drew near, Michelle no longer waited for her husband's homecoming with the fervor of a wife. She was getting ready to face him, her beliefs, and the possibility that her marriage might never be the same again. The focus of the Duggar household had always been Jim Bob. His regulations dictated every routine, his voice held authority, and his approval, or lack thereof, influenced his children's decisions. However, that authority disbanded following the trial. All that was left was resentment, guilt, and a silent uprising simmering within the very household he had once dominated. The kids weren't sure how to react at first. Some of the younger ones repeated their father's comments as if they were infallible, clinging to his letters. However, the older kids, who had endured enough of his control, started to have a different perspective. After reviewing the records and hearing Jinger's account, they came to the conclusion that their father had stolen from his own daughter. Late-night whispered conversations become more straightforward. One child remarked, "He always taught us that faith is built on honesty." Another said, "But he lied to us all." Others were inspired by Jinger's bravery in opposing him. Once apprehensive siblings started to voice their own complaints. Not about property theft, but rather over years of silence and Jim Bob's judgments that disregard their uniqueness. What began as a single act of treachery turned into a mirror that silently reflected all of the children's wounds. Jim Bob tried calling from prison, but some people wouldn't pick up. After hearing his voice, other people who had picked up the phone hung up. The once unwavering respect had vanished. The youngsters stopped referring to themselves as Jim Bob's kids. Rather, they leaned on their own names and trajectories. Michelle also became aware of the shift. Their father's prayers, which used to dominate family dinners, suddenly had a new beat. Under Jim Bob's severe control, the kids would never have been able to talk freely, laugh aloud, or even debate. It seemed as though something long repressed had been revealed by his absence. The transition was defined more by one moment than by another. "What does your father mean to you now?" a videographer asked one of the youngsters during a production interview. "He's not my father anymore," the youngster said firmly after pausing to glance down. "He is simply Jim Bob." The family was affected by the statement. Others followed suit, one by one. In a final act of separation, they repudiated his status as their father, not merely out of rage. Fatherhood meant more to them than a title. It meant love, trust, and direction. Jim Bob had also given it up. There was nothing theatrical or loud about the rejection. It was absolute, steady, and silent. Jim Bob's followers were no longer the Duggar kids. They served as his judges, and it was evident that he had lost them. Jim Bob Duggar lost everything that made him who he was while he was in prison. The sharp suits, the dominant presence at the family table, and the unwavering stares of TV cameras that previously praised his life were all gone. They were replaced by a small cot, a gray uniform, and the sound of iron doors clanging behind him. Jim Bob was no longer the patriarch within those confines. His name was reduced to a file number, and he was simply another prisoner. While the other inmates treated him suspiciously, the guards showed him no concern. Some people had seen him on TV. "Ain't you that family guy?" they murmured, although their remarks were mocking rather than respectful. At night, as the block's commotion subsided into a tense quiet, Jim Bob gazed at the ceiling and reenacted his fall. He reminded himself that he was still a devout man and that he had been misinterpreted. However, the persistent reality would not go away. He had defrauded his daughter, and now even his own children were abandoning him. A few letters arrived, but not as many as he had anticipated. A few younger kids sent crayon-colored notes, but the bigger kids said nothing. Michelle's writing was brief and circumspect. She talked about the kids' welfare and everyday life at home, but she never mentioned love or longing. Jim Bob felt the icy gap between them growing as he read her letters. It was not just a familial loss. His money fell apart. The empire he had attempted to establish, real estate, appearances, and influence, collapsed without his careful supervision. Contracts were terminated, business partners left, and the family's once strong public image collapsed. Once a byword for devout parenthood, his name now frequently featured in headlines with the word embezzler. In prison, he made an effort to maintain appearances. He attempted to appear composed and authoritative, carried his Bible, and led little prayer groups. He was a fallen man looking for significance among those who could see through the mask. Yet even in those circles, he was not a leader. Finding out that some of his children had openly refused him, as their father was the toughest blow. He heard the words, read from a newspaper clipping, "He's not my father anymore," and the walls of the prison appeared to close in on him. "He is simply Jim Bob." Jim Bob cried that night for the first time in years. For the hollowness of a life based on control rather than trust, not for the loss of money or prestige. In prison, deprived of his family and authority, he had to confront the reality he had long resisted. He had lost everything. There was no rejoicing on the day of Jim Bob Duggar's release. There were no waiting wives or happy kids outside the jail gates. After 6 months in prison, the humiliated patriarch emerged into the public eye, with cameras flashing and only a handful of reporters ready. His eyes were hollow, his posture hunched, and his hair was thinner. He thought Michelle would be present. She has supported him through scandal and criticism for decades. She stayed at home this time, though. Long ago, she had made the decision that she would not welcome him like a hero on the way back. She made it plain that he was no longer the focal point of her life by spending the day with the kids and going to church by herself. Jim Bob discovered the family house had changed when he got back. The room seemed colder and more empty. There was a silence he could not ignore at the dining table that used to be crowded with kids. When he walked in, the conversation ceased. A few of the kids hardly gave him a glance. Some didn't even acknowledge him. Michelle's voice was courteous yet cold. She treated him more like a distant relative than a husband, someone who was trusted yet tolerated. She no longer protected him from the children's rage. or defended him in front of them. Her separation was irrevocable and more painful than any jail time. Jinger never showed up. The betrayal was unforgivable to her. She established her own life in a remote location, turning down calls and visits. The loudest rejection of all was her absence. Jim Bob made an effort to get the family together, pray at the table, and regain some of the power he had previously held. However, his statements were meaningless. Before he finished, the kids shifted uneasily, looked at each other, and several left. He was no longer a father or a leader. The outer world has also changed. Once associated with a brand of harmless television, the Duggar name now bore the taint of controversy. Interview offers centered on crime and demise, rather than faith and family. There were only shards of recollection left after the fall of the empire he created. Jim Bob sat by himself in his study in the evenings, surrounded by old family album shelves. He turned the pages and gazed at happy features that no longer had a loving gaze. Every picture served as a reminder of both what he had lost forever and what he had previously had. The Duggar family patriarch was no longer a father who was revered, a spouse who was loved, or a man of power. All he was Jim Bob, isolated from the consequences of his own decisions. His life's narrative concluded in stillness, the silence of a family that had at last overcome his shadow, rather than in victory or unanimity. After Jim Bob returned home, months went by, yet the damage was not repaired. The ties that formerly bound the Duggar family together were irreparably shattered, and they merely lived together in name. The elder children chose to live farther away from their father's shadow and establish their own homes and customs. Some ceased going by the family name while they were in public. Others decided that the Duggar legacy was too much to bear and discreetly severed all connections. Michelle stayed at home, but her husband was no longer the center of her existence. Instead of imposing the rules that Jim Bob had once insisted on, she supported her children's independence and gave her whole attention to them. She was still guided by her beliefs, but she now understood loyalty as intense protection of her children rather than mindless devotion to her husband. Jim Bob, on the other hand, had trouble finding significance. He made an effort to reintegrate into the society, but the church that had once commended him now regarded him with distrust. His neighbors averted their eyes. Business associates turned them away. No matter how many Bible texts he cited or how many times he practiced his apologies, the trust he had lost could not be regained. He was not saved, not even in his own house. His conversations with his kids were awkward, short, and frequently chilly. Some declined to respond to his inquiries. When he stepped into the room, others left. His presence depleted respect, not earned it. The girl at the center of it all, Jinger, talked openly about her suffering and recovery in interviews. She didn't say who her father was. Rather, she talked about breaking cycles of control, liberation, and the value of truth. Many people who had previously admired the Duggar family from a distance found resonance in her statements. She turned into a representation of tenacity and Jim Bob into a warning story. Once associated with power and celebrity, the Duggar family name was now associated with scandal. What began as a reality show based on the ideal of a father figure turned into a tale of rejection, imprisonment, and betrayal. Jim Bob was alone in his study, going through his faded photos, his tattered Bible, and his letters. One day, he assured himself his kids might forgive him and Michelle might come back to him. However, he understood deep down that his legacy was one of treachery rather than faith or unity. Jim Bob was struggling to rebuild his reputation, while Jinger Vuolo was creating something fresh. She and her spouse established a more tranquil existence away from Arkansas, unburdened by the demands of the Duggar family. For the first time, she was just Jinger, a woman who defined herself according to her own standards, rather than Jim Bob's daughter. The scandal that had previously clouded her image turned into the same thing that made her strong. Journalists and documentarians who were interested in her viewpoint invited her. She hesitated at first. It was dangerous to discuss her relatives in public. However, when she reflected on her father's deceit and the years of silence she had experienced, Jinger came to the realization that her narrative was not unique to her. Rather, it belonged to everyone who had been kept silent under the pretense of control, faith, or family. She spoke in a measured but impactful manner. She talked about the liberation that came from letting go of fear, about truth, and about having the guts to face betrayal. In one interview, she claimed, "My father taught me rules, but rules without trust mean nothing. I discovered that honesty is the foundation of a true family. The titles father and leader are meaningless without it." People paid attention. Her memoirs showed readers not just a daughter who had been harmed, but also a lady who had overcome suffering. Supporters referred to her as inspirational, while critics referred to her as daring. As a result of one of the most well-known scandals in reality TV history, she became a voice for people who wished to rebel against repressive family structures and a symbol of tenacity. Michelle, quietly observing from home, was proud and saddened. Pride at her daughter's discovery of her voice. She was sorry that she had to use such voice because of her husband's behavior. Michelle saw Jinger's ascent as evidence that brokenness might give birth to strength. Jim Bob read about Jinger's increasing influence from a distance back in Arkansas. Every interview and story seemed like a door closing on him. He had once thought his children would carry on his legacy. Now he saw Jinger redefining it against his will. Jinger, however, didn't turn around. Her priorities were her family, her purpose to voice for those who had none, and her faith reinterpreted according to her own ideas. Her independence was sparked by what her father had meant by control. Jim Bob's delusion of power ended with Jinger Vuolo's ascent, in addition to her personal metamorphosis. Her name was just starting to soar, whereas his had collapsed. The majority of Michelle Duggar's life had been spent under Jim Bob's shadow. She had been his silent companion for decades, grinning for the cameras, echoing his statements, and bringing up their kids according to his dictates. However, she was unable to ignore the reality after his prosecution, prison term, and family breakup. Loyalty had bound her to a man who had violated not only their daughter, but also the same principles he professed to support. Michelle felt the pressure of a decision mounting every day. The guy who entered the house was not the spouse she had known, but Jim Bob had come home. He talked about forgiving others and restoring the family name, but he never really acknowledged his own guilt. Even as his children turned away, his pride remained unwavering. Michelle sat alone herself at night in the same kitchen where she used to feed her kids numerous meals. The house's silence revealed to her what she had been denying for years. Jim Bob was now the head of ruins rather than a family. More than ever, the kids confided in her. Some acknowledged that they had no desire to see him. "Mom, you don't have to keep standing by him," remarked others bluntly. Michelle didn't stand up for him for the first time. She just listened. She found solace in her faith, but it also helped her make sense of things. Yes, forgiveness was mentioned in the Bible, but so were truth, responsibility, and safeguarding the defenseless. She became aware that she had mistaken loyalty for complicity and submit for silence. She was living a lie to her kids, as well as to herself, by staying at Jim Bob's side. One Sunday morning was the tipping point. As she had done for months, Michelle went to church without Jim Bob by her side. She didn't wait for him at the door when the service ended, though. Instead, leaving him in the pew, she left with her kids, heads held high. Despite being silent, the deed conveyed a strong message. She would no longer let his shadow to define who she was. She sat her kids down at home and said things they had been dying to hear. "For many years, I supported your father because I felt it was my responsibility. However, I have an obligation to you now, to live in peace, to honor the truth, and to keep you safe. I have a clear choice. I choose us, regardless of what happens with your father. Without lying, this is the family I have chosen." The decision wasn't loud or dramatic for Michelle. It was final, steady, and liberating. She didn't make any public remarks or file for divorce. However, her life changed. She ceased defending Jim Bob and started living her own life, devoted to her children and the truth instead of a broken man. If you're looking for more Duggar family exclusive gossip, come back to Vogue TV for all your updates by guys.